Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. Yes, it's cold. It has been cold for several days. I am recording for this morning's Sunday school lesson on Friday midday. The streets are slippery. And the forecast is that it's going to get worse over the weekend. You may have already experienced that. I hope you're able to stay at home, stay warm, and off the streets. And be sure to tune in to the church's service over on Facebook. Today's lesson, we continue to study from Luke's Gospel. We today are in the 6th chapter. We return. We have been in the 6th chapter once before, but now we return, and our focal passages will be on the first 11 verses of chapter 6. Starting with verse 12, Jesus is preparing, he will be calling his apostles, according to Luke's account, and then he will deliver what has been called the Sermon on the Plains, as opposed to Matthew's chapters 5, 6, and 7, part of 7, where he delivers the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Plains we referenced a few weeks ago when we had a study out of the middle of chapter 6. We're not there, and so I'm just making a reference to that interesting title, that interesting sermon, the Sermon on the Plains. That's not where we are yet. When Jesus is, and Luke is going to be examining Jesus' treatment of the Sabbath and the lessons that Jesus is teaching his people. He's also teaching his critics, the scribes and Pharisees. But we need to set up the context in order to fully understand what Jesus is teaching, because the observance of the Sabbath was an extremely important time or event for the Jewish people, especially the Pharisees. The Pharisees had taken the law from the Old Testament, from the Torah, the first 5, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they had begun to enact rules and regulations, interpretations that became rules. So what are we talking about? Well, first let me say that observing these rules, and especially the Sabbath observations or the rules relating to the Sabbath, was one of the main markers of following the Jewish law and being the people of God. It was one of the main ways they showed to other people that they were God's people and other people were not. And so those who broke the law or the Sabbath laws, at least especially in the minds of the Pharisees, they had demonstrated that they really were not the true people of God. So how big a problem are we talking about, and what are we talking about? Well, for instance, the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments even, they're to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. But what did that specifically mean? The Pharisees, over a period of many, many years, had developed these rules, these interpretations, so people would know what it would mean. There was good intention at first. I think there was good intention all the way through. They just lost sight of what God intended when he instructed his people to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Their rules, the rules of the Pharisees, quite frankly, went way beyond anything that was expressed in the Scripture. But they had taken on their own level of scriptural commands, so that by the time of Jesus' day and appearance, essentially these rules and the Pharisees had lost sight of what was really important and what the whole point of the Sabbath was. They needed someone to step in with authority to put the Sabbath in proper perspective. So let me again set just a little bit more of the state. Well, let's read the first few verses, the first two verses of chapter 6, Luke's Gospel. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, almost certainly wheat, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Now, in going through the fields, and essentially they were traveling, and it was permissible. In fact, there probably were paths that cut through the grain fields. I enjoy bird hunting in Nebraska once a year with a friend who has been hosting us for 40 years. My dad, until he passed away a couple of years ago, now 3.5 years ago, we had gone 39 straight years. It was a great time with my dad, but that's beside. I'm getting away from the point. Grain fields may stretch for miles. Wheat fields and corn fields, and there will be paths between them. We would think of them as caliche roads, except they're not caliche, they're just dirt. Jesus and his disciples were passing through, and they were crossing a grain field, and his disciples picked a head of grain, wheat, which I have seen and I have done, and they would rub the heads of grain in their hands, which would separate the kernels of wheat from the grassy portion. It's called the chaff of the head of wheat. Then, blowing in their hands, they would blow that grassy part away, leaving the heavier kernels, which they'd just pop in their mouth and chew. What they were doing is not against the law. It was specifically and expressly permitted over in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, where, paraphrased, it said, especially the poorer person traveling has the right to pick a head of grain, could even be an ear of corn, I suppose, if he just using his hands. But he couldn't do that with a scythe, a knife. So they were doing what was expressly permitted in Old Testament law. And you'll note that the Pharisees, as we get into it, you'll see the Pharisees are not talking about that, and they're not saying that's unlawful, you're stealing somebody's grain. No, it is expressly allowed for. What they were claiming is that the disciples were violating the regulations that the Pharisees had imposed, namely, to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. They said, you shall not work on the Sabbath. Now, that's not terribly unusual, even for us in this day. I can remember, maybe many of you who are watching our Sunday school lesson are not old enough, experienced enough to remember when we had what were called blue laws that said businesses could not open on Sunday. Why? Because that would be work, and that would be a violation of the Old Testament or the biblical requirements to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. But then the question came to the Pharisees as they were drafting, and the people of Israel, what is work? Define work. And they started defining work. And so when the disciples plucked the head of grain off, they were harvesting. Harvesting is work. When they rubbed the head of grain of wheat in their hands, they were threshing. That's work. That's what you did to get the grain ready for market or to be eaten by animals or made into bread, whatever. And to blow the grassy part, the chaff, off of the kernels or away from the kernels, that's winnowing. The farmer would actually have the grain harvested and threshed, that is, agitated, so to try to get the grass apart, take a big shovel or really a fork and throw it up in the air. The wind would blow the chaff away. That's winnowing. So they were engaging in several kinds of work. And that's what the Pharisees are accusing the disciples of doing. You're violating the prohibitions, the restrictions that have become, in essence, the same thing as the law. Now, another question comes to mind, and that is, what are the Pharisees doing following Jesus and his disciples? They're following them as they walk through the grain fields. One commentary said, quite possibly, somebody is counting Jesus' steps to see if he violates the regulation. This is all on the Sabbath. The regulation against walking more than a mile on the Sabbath. That then becomes work. So they're counting his steps, perhaps. And then there's all kinds of devious ways, not necessarily devious, but convoluted ways to avoid it. You walk for a mile, sit down, and then get up and walk for another mile. Things of that nature. Nevertheless, they're following Jesus and they're looking for a mistake. And now they think they have found one. And so a minor issue of taking the head of grain and rubbing it in your hands, they're blowing it up into a major issue. And it becomes a point of extreme annoyance. And it's easy to make a minor matter become a major matter when you have already determined ahead of time that you don't like that person, that you may even hate that person, and you want to see them fail. So the Pharisees are jumping on the tiniest infraction, although even in reality, this probably wasn't an unlawful infraction at all. Now, we come to Jesus' response, and we're going to see that Jesus doesn't argue the law with them. He doesn't try to argue with them that this is not an infraction, that it's not illegal, it's permitted in Deuteronomy, and this is, okay, it's on the Sabbath, but he's not arguing that. Let's see how he responds. And so we look at verses 3 through 5. And it's going to be very interesting. I think it's very interesting, and I hope you will see it and see interest and see the point. Jesus answered them, in verse 3, Jesus answered them, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now that is amazing. But what is Jesus saying? First off, he says, have you never read what David did? Well, of course they had read what David did, but Jesus' comment is sort of an insult to them. How's that an insult? He is suggesting that they may have read the Old Testament, but they really don't understand it. David, I'm sorry, I've got thoughts running three different ways in my mind. So let's go on with the main idea. What is going on in the story that Jesus is talking about? David has already been named, selected by God, and anointed as the rightful king of Israel. He was anointed by Samuel. We know the story of Samuel going to Jesse and, do you have a son? And he looks at all of Jesse's sons and says, this is not who God chooses. Do you not have any other sons? And Jesse says, oh, well, yeah, the shepherd boy, our youngest son, will go bring him. And it's David. And Samuel says, this is who God chooses to be the next king. But Saul is still on the throne. And Saul, even though David is trying to serve him, having killed Goliath, Saul gets upset easily. He's in the process of losing his mind, quite frankly. And he, at times, threatens to kill David. And so David, by this point, is a man. Saul is upset with David because the crowds say Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. David is the new choice. And Saul is out to get him, and so David and his followers, some would say his disciples, flee. And in fleeing, they stop at a place called Nob, N-O-B, and talk to the priest Abimelech and say, we're hungry. Abimelech is a little bit frightened. He knows who David is, but he knows Saul is still the king. David says, we're hungry. Give us some food. We're on a special mission, which was not totally true. They were fleeing from Saul. And Abimelech, the priest, said, there is nothing here except the bread that has been consecrated. It is holy bread, and it can only be eaten by the priest. And David says, let me have it anyway. And he takes it and gives it to his people. Now, Jesus is not saying, inciting that example, he is not saying, here's precedent. This was done, it really wasn't legal, but it was permissible for David to do it. Basically what he is, that's the way it comes across. And therefore I can do it and my followers can do it. That's not really what he was doing. The point of Jesus' story is not really whether David ate the bread that was reserved for the priests alone, therefore being unlawful, but instead that David had the rightful authority to do what he did. He was the appointed by God and anointed as the king of Israel. He was being chased by his enemies, Saul, who wanted to do away with him. That's the exact position Jesus is in. He is the rightful king of Israel. He is the anointed one. That is the actual meaning of Messiah, the anointed one. He's also, in many respects, on the run. He can't even get away from his enemies. They're following him even as he moves from this part of the countryside to that part of the countryside, counting his steps, perhaps, looking for any way to accuse him. They actually plotted and were soon plotting to kill him. And so, like David, even though he had yet to be recognized as the rightful king and sit on his throne, because Jesus was in the same position as David and had authority, just like David, to supersede the normal rules or protocol, the Pharisees had no basis to charge him or his followers with violating the law. In fact, Jesus' authority went beyond that of David's. David was appointed by God and anointed by Samuel as the king of Israel, as we said. But Jesus was the Son of God. He was identifying himself to the Pharisees, and possibly in somewhat mysterious tenets and terms, he says, the Son of Man. Now, of course, that's the reference to Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, where Daniel talked about his visions of what he saw. He said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So Jesus used that term, the Son of Man, as his favorite self-description. It is absolutely a messianic reference. But he goes a step further. He says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Here, Jesus is literally claiming to be deity. And so, as God, he has the authority to set the rules concerning the Sabbath. And so, because the Pharisees had failed to understand that the purpose of the Sabbath from the very beginning was to assist man and not the other way around. So Luke included this story and the following story, also dealing with the Sabbath. Let's look at verses 6 through 11 as we conclude our lesson this morning. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue, and this is a story that I know most all of you are well familiar with. It is the healing of the man with the withered hand. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them and then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. In another gospel, they plotted to kill Jesus. The problem is quite possibly not so much that Jesus was violating their regulations. If so, it was in the most minor way. It was the fact that he had authority and claimed authority. And so they had problems accepting Jesus and his authority over the Sabbath and his claim to be able to bring a new understanding to what the Sabbath was all about. Because, as I say, they failed to understand the true purpose of the Sabbath. In this first, in the grain field confrontation, where the Pharisees were following Jesus, and then here, it seems that Jesus might even have been intentionally instigating the situations as an opportunity to teach important principles. But note, verse 7 says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. One commentary said, quite possibly, they made sure the man with the withered hand was in the synagogue that Sunday that Jesus came to this synagogue to teach. The reference is in chapter 6, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and then verse 6, on another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue. Luke is giving us detail, but not so much that we get bogged down with the actual date. But it is on a Sabbath, it is in the synagogue, and he is putting forth the principles, the events to prove the principles that Jesus was teaching. Another commentary says it's possible Jesus knew ahead of time that the man with the withered hand was going to be there, and he intentionally goes in there for the purpose of finding somebody to heal so he could confront the Pharisaical beliefs, because they were watching him closely, so he could teach again, so he could teach the principles. The principles about the purpose of the Sabbath, and that Jesus was who he said he is, or who he ultimately says he is. So what was the Sabbath for? As Jesus asked, was it a day where evil was to be done, or a day where good is to be done? Are we to save lives or to destroy lives on the Sabbath? Jesus technically didn't do anything that would constitute work, even by the Pharisees' strictest interpretations of the law. He did not touch the man. He did not get up. All he did was speak and called the man in front and told him to stretch out his hand. And in doing so, when the man did that, obeyed Jesus, he was healed. So Luke is combining several themes here in this early chapter. One of the first ones is he is teaching us that faith is productive when people simply obey Jesus, solely on the basis of his words, solely on what we read. Think of our lesson last week with Peter doing what Jesus said, even though he had fished all night and caught nothing, just because Jesus said, throw your net out. Peter did so and caught the biggest catch of his life. Another lesson, Jesus could heal, or another theme anyway, Jesus could heal and even suspend the normal expectations or law or regulations of the Sabbath, because he was the coming king. He is, in fact, the Son of God, the Son of Man, foretold messianically by Daniel. In each of the situations we see in chapter 6, Jesus put the Pharisees in very difficult positions. If David had the authority to suspend the Sabbath laws in certain situations, then so did the Son of Man, the Son of God, Jesus. If God had created the Sabbath to honor him, then wouldn't it be right to do good things that brought life, or good, rather than evil? And the The assumption Jesus has is that to do nothing in situations like this, when you are capable of doing good, would be to do evil. The Pharisees were perfectly happy to allow this man to continue to suffer. They would have Jesus not heal him at all on the Sabbath, but make him wait until another time, thus allowing this man to continue to suffer. So these situations really didn't come down to breaking Sabbath regulations. They came down to the all-important issue of the authority and identity of Jesus. If he was who he was subtly claiming to be, then he absolutely had the authority to do what he was doing. And we know Jesus to be who he was trying to teach the Pharisees that he was. Interestingly, the Pharisees go out and do far greater evil, plotting to kill someone because he had done good on the Sabbath, far greater than anything they were claiming to be Jesus violations. The point, we should look at the purpose of God's law, the spirit of the law, rather than getting lost in nitpicking rules and regulations that in these instances seem to be more important than the spirit of God's rules and laws. Being good to man, taking care of the needs of people, over following the ritual of religion. Jesus is instituting the new covenant, the new way of life and relationship with God. It is through him, God's Son, not through rote following of rituals and rules. An interesting lesson, one I have enjoyed. I hope you have gained something from this lesson study today as well. Thank you for being with us. Now stay warm, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you.